So let's get on with the grand finale here. But before that, I'll let you in on a secret. Zach, why don't you come on stage first? It's very important that you come on stage. You know, this year we had a theme of trying to select our keynote speakers. Now, Avdi started it, Zach is ending it, and we said they should have something in common with me. What do you think?
Look at there.
So, Zach actually requires very little introduction. But for those who are new in the community, he's been programming for the last 20 years, professionally for the last almost a little more than 10 years.
Yeah, something like that.
He spent the largest stint in GitHub. He's one of the first engineers at GitHub. All right, so you already have a question for you, which we'll take up after when he finishes his talk.
Yeah.
Right? Depends if you give it in UTC or not, but we'll figure it out. And he's currently, he's got his own startup called During, which is supposed to change the way you schedule your meetings. How's that for a tagline?
That's pretty good, yeah.
Okay, so let's get on with the talk and ensure that we are in the same time. All yours, Zach.
Thanks. I've never actually gone on the start of a stage with such silence before, so can we please give me a round of applause just for a little... First thing I noticed when I walked in the room yesterday was like the timeline. And you know, you're all talking about like, oh yeah, you know, this 9th Ruby conference that we've done, and that's really cool. And I was like, yeah, but why do you only have 2010 on the timeline? Like, you should go back further. And then it took me a couple of seconds. I'm like, 2010 was like 8 years ago. I still think it's a couple of years ago. So I don't know what that means, other than I can't keep track of time, I guess, which is normally fine. But like, I'm giving a talk about time, so I mean, hold on. Like, who knows what's going to happen for this one? So it's time to talk about time. If you don't like those puns, you're going to have a really hard time with this talk. They're all over the place. Yeah, time is hard. Like, spoiler alert. Time is very difficult. And it's not a language thing. It's not like Ruby is going to suddenly make your life better with time, or if you switch to PHP or C or any weird stuff like that. Pretty much everyone's going to have to deal with time at some point. You're going to have to deal with a timestamp or some limited way of sorting things and all that sort of stuff. You can't hide from it, and this should terrify you. One thing that you hear a lot is just use UTC, being like the standard for formatting time and stuff like that. And we hear this a lot of Stack Overflow, a lot of Reddit comments, and like blog posts and thought-leading pieces, and everyone's like, yeah, just set your server to UTC and you'll be fine. That's not wrong. That's helpful, but there's so much more to talk about. There is 43 minutes left to talk about of time. So that's what we're going to talk about. This is me. I'm Zach Holman, Holman on social things. This isn't a photo of me necessarily. This is a metaphor. I represent programming time, and my cat represents how terrified you are of me, because time is truly terrifying. I started writing Ruby 12, 13 years ago, and so I've been in this community for a long time. I've worked at GitHub for a while. While I was at GitHub, one of my coworkers, just as like the common joke over a long time, just kept saying, Zach, no matter what, just make sure you never build a calendar or do any scheduling or do anything in time zones whatsoever. And I was like, yeah, okay. In unrelated news, I started a startup that is a calendar. I'm not very good at following directions, and I've had a rough last year. There's been a lot of just headaches dealing with time and time problems and all this sort of stuff. And I'm clearly on the far end of the spectrum of like, you're probably not going to run into the problems that I've been running into, but everyone runs into these types of problems when you deal with time and software. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. There's like 3 main things I want to talk about. First of all, what is time? Very philosophical. We'll get into that very slightly. Next, why time is hard, because I think it's good to analyze, like, why is it hard? And then we can, start complaining about it later. And then the meat of it all is just, code and time. How can we better write software to deal with these types of edge cases and problems and stuff like that? So the first thing is just, it's a question as old as time. What is time? It's confusing. Does time even exist? Which is funny because it turns out it may not, I guess. Like quantum physicists are like, if you stare at time and slow things down and something, it's possible time doesn't exist. Then there's like relativity where like time changes and different, all this other stuff. I'm not going to talk about today because I don't have a PhD in time stuff. I could probably fake it, but there's enough other logistical things to worry about instead. And you're probably not going to have to deal with quantum mechanics inside your Rails app anyway. So let's start out with just a brief timeline of time. 4000 BC started having astronomical clocks for the first time, because I guess beforehand they were just like looking up and it's like, well, it's light, so it's day, and then, nope, there's no light, I guess it's night. So we started, fiddling around with that. 1500 BC, we started having sundial subdivisions, starting figuring out like how far into a day you are before the sun will go down and stuff like that. 14th century was like the first time when we started having fixed length hours. Before that, like the hour length changed seasonally depending on like how you grow things differently, I guess. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know. 16th century started having minutes. Nobody really cared about minutes before then because we just didn't schedule work that way. And then seconds in the 17th century, and then like the 19th century, people started to standardize what the concept of time was. 1883, the US was like, okay, we have a bunch of railroads, they're going really fast, all of the cities have totally different time zones, this is confusing. So they set up a telegram and started just sending signals to synchronize all the time between all these different places. So that was like the first real big start of like, oh, this is what time and time zones and all this stuff is going to be. 1967, the atomic standard of the second was basically created. So if you have a bunch of cesium atoms in your backyard, you can sit down and wait for 9,192,631,770 energy transitions of the cesium atom, and that is 1 second. It's pretty accurate, too. We're within 1 second lost in every 1.4 million years when you look at atomic time. We lose about 2 nanoseconds a month, which is probably why I'm late to your meeting. I apologize. And this is pretty good. We have, there's some interesting stuff in the future. Optical clocks are really interesting. They like tick 100,000 times faster than the atom transitions that we were looking at. So that would be, if we can make these optical clocks in a really good way, if you could start the clock at the start of the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, and you run it continuously to today, we would have only lost 100 seconds on that clock. So that's crazy. I don't know who spends their time worrying about this stuff, but I'm glad somebody else does. It's amazing. And that brings us today, where you fuck up another time zone bug and you get really angry at time. So, everything that I just said revolves around one simple question. What time is it? It's like, what time is it? Thank you. Right on the spot there. I like it. At a certain point, we started asking this question because we had, things to do and stuff. It became important to know when somebody had to go into work and, or plow the fields or something like that. But the question really implied something else. The question implied, what time is it here? Because we couldn't travel that far in a day. You could walk pretty far, but that's basically where you started off. Like, it's not that big of a deal. At a certain point, we started changing that to what time is it there. We had, cars and planes and automobiles and all this sort of stuff. And the question became important. And this question truly ruined everything. Everything from this point on in my talk stems from this problem of trying to figure out, how does my time relate to this person across the world type of deal? Or even across the city, no, not city, state, whatever the case is. I really like this little bit. This is from 1854. It's a time plate of, it just basically describes, here are all these different cities in this world. Each city has a totally different time zone, which can be it's 12:03 here, and then 20 miles away, it's 12:07, and then 30 miles away. It's a bunch of all this other stuff. Time was really complicated. So if you start wondering, okay, This is terrible. Like when we're in the 1800s trying to fix the railroad problem, like this is terrible. How do we do a good time standard? You know, you kind of expect, well, 24 hours in a day, let's just do 24 time zones. That would be logical, and nothing about time is ever logical. We have 39 time zones right now, and this is because time zones get added gradually and haphazardly. The time zone data gets updated dozens of times a year today. It's frustrating, but that's what we have to deal with. And time zones, as you know around here, they're not just plus or minus 1 hour. It can be 30 minutes off, 45 minutes off. Like there's no real rhyme or reason of what's going to happen with all this stuff. All of this is based on politics and irregularity. You know, time is hard. It's basically humans trying to take politics and borders and all this sort of stuff and trying to map it on top of a really irregular system, because a second is not a natural thing. It's just a bunch of energy transitions again. So this stuff gets really tricky. And that brings us to the next part. Like, why is time so hard? And this is where all the problems with computers come in right after this. Don't worry, humans have been terrible at time for a long time. It's not just you. As a civilization, we're pretty shit. We're just not good at this sort of stuff. It's kind of like you just envision, like, I'm going to build this amazing house. It's going to have everything that I want in it, and it's going to be fancy and all this sort of stuff. And then you build it on just this terrible foundation, and it's just like balancing like it's about to explode or something like that. Problems are naturally going to happen. So, for example, does everybody know where they were and what they were doing December 30th, 2011? Drinking beer. So for the rest of you, you all must be Samoan. Because Samoa did not have a December 30th, 2011. They went from December 29th, 2011 to December 31st, 2011. They decided, hey, we are in the ocean, and we're on basically the wrong side of the date line, because most of our trading partners are in Australia, Japan, China. We should be on their same time zone, so we're not still working when they're on Saturday and we're on Friday. So they're like, all right, we're just going to move over a little bit and then change time zones, move forward a day. The other important thing to notice is American Samoa is about 100 kilometers away. It's not too far away. So here's the breakdown. It's got Samoa time zone, which is Samoa and American Samoa. So if you don't know, that's two different countries. It's not really two different countries. It's a country in an unincorporated territory of the United States. Samoa decides we're going to piece out of Samoa time zone. We're going to go to the West Samoa time zone. They're going to be over there. Samoa time zone's at UTC minus 11. West Samoa is at plus 12 UTC. It's 24 hours ahead of American Samoa, even though there's only 100 kilometers that splits between them. It's not actually 24 hours ahead, because it's more like 25 hours, because even though Samoa didn't observe daylight savings time, West Samoa also didn't observe daylight savings time, but they decided to start doing daylight savings time in 2009, which didn't happen because there was an earthquake and tsunami, so they moved that to 2010. Now, all of this was the opposite of July 4th, 1892, when Samoa actually did the exact opposite. And they looked around and they're like, hey, we're on the wrong side of the date line. Our biggest trading partner is the US. We should go to theirs. So in that case, they had two July 4th, 1892, which happens to be our Independence Day. So they got to do like fireworks 2 days in a row, which is wild. So that was really cool. This is also important to mention that Tokelau, which is a territory of New Zealand, is right in the area too, and they decided to do the same thing and move down from Samoa time to West Samoa time on December 30th, 2011 as well. They did an interview with some people from Samoa, and they said, like, you can hear the sound of a lot of vehicles going around town, going around the town center clock and tooting their horns, people screaming. We have once again achieved another milestone in our history of Samoa. I don't know who said that, but whoever said it clearly doesn't have to program the time zones resulting from this change. Time is hard. Another quick example. Russia switched to the Gregorian calendar in 1918. 1908, they were still on the Julian calendar. England, on the other hand, Gregorian calendar. So two different calendars. Important to note, 1908 was the London Olympics. This was also important to note for the Russian Olympic shooting team, who didn't know that they were on different calendars, and they arrived 12 days late to the Olympics. They got there, and they're like, yeah, event's over, sorry. And they're like, oh, well, that's a bummer. And the only weird thing about this is that, like, Russia should know better, because this happened before. In the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, the Austrian allies were waiting on their Russian allies to come reinforce them. So they're like, on this date, reinforce us, and we're going to take out Napoleon together, and, we'll do great stuff. The plan went according to plan on both calendars, Russia just showed up 12 days late. Napoleon routed Austria, and that was a bummer. Right on top of the hill again. This is just weird stuff that we have to deal with. Time is really hard. I have a whole bunch of other weird examples of all of this sort of stuff I would love to get into, but I just don't have the time. I'm so proud of all of those. So time is really hard. So this brings us to how do we deal with all of this sort of stuff? We have cool computers and keyboards, and now it's on to us to save the world from time zone problems or something. As I was doing this talk, I was listening to my favorite philosopher in the world, which is Nas. And he has this lyric that he says, "You got CD-ROM, everything operates by computers. Then what happens when circuit breaks? Y2K is the big scare. Scientists say we ain't prepared." Now, I don't really know what this means, but I figure if Nas in '99 is worried about Y2K and dates and scientists having problems, we should clearly worry about this too. So thanks, Nas. I appreciate that. First thing I want to talk about is just storing time, because you got to get the data in the system somehow, and once it's there, what do you deal with this? This is when everyone says use UTC. I agree. UTC is great. Let's talk a little bit about this first. UTC, as everyone knows, stands for Universal Coordinated Time. This is weird. So in English, this would end up being Coordinated Universal Time, or CUT. This is what they were going to name it initially. In French, this was Temps Universel Cordon, or something. I can't speak French. So they had two different acronyms from the start, and they're like, well, we can't have an acronym that is different between languages. That's really dumb. So they just settled on UTC, which is either super tragic or the most fitting metaphor for time ever, when from the start we can't figure out a good standard way of doing things. So I find that really adorable. UTC is basically the zero offset. It's the center of all the other time zones which are offset from that time zone. UTC is not GMT. GMT was sort of the unofficial UTC before UTC existed. That's Greenwich Mean Time, also at UTC plus 0, usually. GMT is also a time zone. This is different from UTC, which is a standard. GMT, people actually use that in their day-to-day life. UTC, nobody really uses that except for weird programmers or something like that. And the real important thing with all this, in GMT, some users use daylight savings time. UTC has no daylight savings time. So that's the reason why we use UTC instead of GMT. First thing you really got to ask yourself is, do you really need to store time? I thought this was kind of interesting because I just sort of assumed, well, yeah. Because programmers really want to store that high fidelity format. If I told you, for this new record, I'm going to either let you save 2 weeks ago or the exact time down to the trillionth of a millisecond. Every programmer is going to be like, that one, I need that fidelity. And it's you're never going to use it. And it's but I need it. But you don't always need it sometimes. A birthday is the best example. You could totally survive with just saving the date in the database instead. Use a date column instead of the timestamp column. It saves you a bunch of time down the road. Birthdays don't really have shifting time zones or anything like that, so you're totally fine. Saves you a bunch of headaches, but sometimes you actually do need to start worrying about time. What you'll end up seeing, this is a good example of say you have an events table in a database and you have a column that says starts at. You set this as a timestamp, as normal, and that's cool. One thing that kind of jumps out at me, if you really care about the time in your database and what the user is submitting to you is going to be correct in the future, is that you also need to store the time zone itself. And that should be a string. And the string is the really kind of interesting part, because if you just store the offset, this is 240 minutes away from UTC, that doesn't mean a lot. It'll give you the offset for that point in time, but you don't have the information of what location were you actually in, which is why if you get to the point where you find A, you need the time, and B, you actually need to know where they were at that point or what's going to happen in the future to a really good degree, you save the full qualifier of the time zone instead. Because this means you can always go back and say, okay, does this mean did the user have daylight saving at this point in time or not? Like, you don't get that with just an offset. Next little thing is like transiting time. When you have the time in your database and you're trying to push it out to somewhere else, how do you do all that sort of stuff? Easy answer is just like be consistent in your API calls. That's about all there is to it. And there's like one big answer with all of this, and it's ISO 8601. This basically will be everything you'll ever need. This came out in 1988. The proposal of the standard, it was adopted, and it's just like you should just be using 8601 formatting for all of the time that you send to a client or a server or whatever the case is. In Ruby land, if you pop open a IRB prompt, you can just type out time.now.iso 8601, which everybody knows what happens at that point. You get a no method error because there's one time class in core Ruby and another in Ruby standard library. Like, I don't really understand this, so someone meet me afterwards who can figure this out. Because you have to like require time in order to like use all these cool methods, and this is just really weird. But that's basically like the timestamp that you want. And there's a lot of really good benefits to having this as opposed to storing it in some other fashion. For one, like, you get a nice, easy way to sort things. You just have to do a sort. Any language can do that pretty easily. You can do that by your human eyeballs too. Like, it's pretty easy. You get time zone, you get the offset. You don't get the full location of the user or anything like that, but you at least get a good offset, which you don't get from just using like Unix epoch time or something like that. You don't have any fights over locale differences in terms of like, is this day or is this month or whatever the case is. At the end of the day, like, just use ISO 8601 over the wire. Like, that's what you're going to want. Quick side note, if you're into this sort of stuff, I am apparently now, which is awkward. RFC 3339 came out in 2002, which some people just use interchangeably, which is also kind of true. It's a subset of 8601. Basically means like timestamps are required. It's a little bit more strict, but it's basically the same thing. So whatever the case is, just find a standard, use it. Almost all of the APIs, like I know GitHub's API is using ISO 8601's timestamps to push out. That's just kind of the standard, and you'll save yourself a lot of just headaches by just doing that and having all your clients expect it. From like a Rails standpoint, we have like active support time zone, which has a bunch of really nice things in it. One of the things it has is time.zone, which can give you a really nice, pretty string. And it says like, oh yeah, Pacific time, US and Canada. That's nice, but you should probably never really use this. The one kind of reason you'd use this is to like show it to the user, and they'll have a better way of understanding, oh, what time zone am I in? But this is like a Rails specific thing. This is not like really what you should be using to persist to the database or send to any clients through an API or anything like that. What you really want is like the .tzinfo method on time.zone, which gives you a big object. From there, you want the canonical identifier, and this is really what you should be saving to your session, cookie, database, whatever the case is. This is the IANA identifier. If you've ever heard of the Olson time database, this is what the Olson time database uses. Olson time database is just a long list of all of the time zones and stuff and all the changes and all that sort of stuff. So if you're ever moving this to especially other clients who may be expecting something different, just recognize that the normal time.zone is a Railsism. And any other stuff in Ruby, just look at the timezones gem. Like, it's pretty much got everything you need. Next little bit is formatting time. Once you have the time, how do you format it? I saw this tweet last year, hilarious. The British press corps was actually locked outside of the White House because the Secret Service saw all their credentials and they didn't realize that the UK had like a different date format than the US. There's a lot of problems in America right now, but I guess this is one of them too. Yeah, people have different locales and different expectations of what dates are. In like a 2018 0403, like an 8601 date stamp, you might have different interpretations of the day if you hadn't had that date stamp in the beginning. So England might call it, March 4th. I did that wrong, didn't I? This is the whole problem. I can't even say my own talk. America does it like totally differently. The French probably have some other weird thing. I don't know. I don't speak French. Like, it's really confusing. So with this, like, just use preferences as much as possible. Allow users to set their own preferences, because there's also the cases of like the expat who lives in a country, but they use the date format some other way. So it's one of the things you should probably just try and support if you can. In JavaScript world, there's the INTL, the International Library, Core Library, I don't know. It's in browsers, and it gives you a lot of date and time formatting specific to a particular locale, so you can get into a whole bunch of that sort of stuff. Generally, with all these things, use time libraries where possible. Don't try to do this yourself, because I love you, and you shouldn't be mean to yourself. Moment.js is like the gold standard in JavaScript. A lot of people like date functions. It's coming up. It's probably a better choice going forward at this point. GitHub has a web component called time elements that handles a lot of that locale formatting automatically, so you don't have to do any of that sort of stuff. Just as much as possible, especially if you do anything more than just like printing out a timestamp on a page, start using these libraries early on. And then abstract those abstractions. This means you can bounce between these implementations later on when you decide, oh, this library isn't doing it quite well, or it's too slow or whatever. Because otherwise, like, time goes all over your damn app, and it sucks to have to go in everywhere and like replace it and do all this sort of stuff. It also lets you add hooks to different things. So if you can imagine like a web page, and you all go through all your own time extraction, you can just add like a timer hook, and then that will like update the time every minute or second or whatever the case is. So doing those abstractions ends up being a pretty good win long term. Accessibility is kind of an interesting thing to think about too here. This is pretty common on like an internet web application. It's like a comment, and he's like, oh yeah, so-and-so commented, that's cool. At the bottom, you'll see like the relative timestamp 2 minutes ago. This is like a normal thing to see. This has like a lot of problems with how people do this sort of thing. For the first reason, like, it doesn't update. It's like that timer I was talking about earlier. If you keep your page open for like an hour, it would be nice to have the timestamps update too. Otherwise, you can come back from lunch and be like, well, is this right now, or is this a while ago, or whatever the case is. It also becomes really problematic when it gets really vague. It's like, this happened about a year ago. When was that? Could be like a 12-month span. Like, I want something a little bit more than that. One of the things that GitHub has been doing for ages was basically just this kind of trick where you've probably seen it. You just hover over any timestamp on the page, and it gives you a really nice human-formatted timestamp that you can actually look at and be like, oh yeah, that happened on June 2nd or whatever. Highly suggest doing that. The real approach that you really want to take here is to use the time element. This came out in 2010 or something like that. It's good browser support and stuff like that. You can put your relative time straight into the element just like normal. You can add your title to get that mouse over, and that's the point where you make it sort of human readable and kind of nice. Wow, that was weird. And then you add a final like date time attribute to the element as well. This is, as you would guess it, formatted in ISO 8601 because it's everywhere, and you want like a machine readable microformat to figure out, not all of your users are going to be human, and having this next to the relative timestamp is just going to help everybody out. Inputting time. This is a disaster. I don't know if you've ever looked at like date pickers, time pickers, all this sort of stuff. This is a section of the talk I just like to call Everything is Terrible. There's so many things around, they all seem kind of garbage. At a certain point, like, browser makers got together and then they saw this and they're like, well, we have the input element, we should just fix this for everybody. So they're like, okay, we can do input type equals time, and like this is on Chrome, and you get kind of like a time picker, and you can like select stuff, and that's cool, I guess. You could also have input type equals date, and this is Chrome's implementation of this, and it's a date picker, I guess. This is input type equals date in Safari. Safari, I love Safari. I use it. They just quit caring a few years ago, I feel. So this is one of the things that Safari is just like, nah, we're not going to do that. And on top of this, like, if you don't like those styles in Chrome or whatever, really hard to restyle input. There's some things you just straight up can't do. You can style some hooks into it, but like, not really. So all of this is kind of disaster. I was talking to one of my friends who was really into browser standards and all that sort of stuff, and I was like, when is input type equals date? When is that going to be well supported? And she just was like, oh God, probably never. So once again, everything is terrible. Basically, my advice with all this, if you're trying to get data in from your user. Just pick something, style it as well as you can, and just give up, because I still haven't found like a good time or date picker that is accessible, keyboard accessible, performant, fast, looks nice, all of the above. So yeah, just find something, stick with it. Next thing I want to talk about is time logic. Natural language is a complicated thing to talk about, obviously, but with time, it's kind of interesting. If you say something like, yeah, the third Wednesday in November at 3 p.m., you could parse that and all that sort of stuff. Like, this is nice because we're cool Rubyists. So we have chronic. Chronic's been around for ages at this point. It's well tested. That will basically just parse that natural language sentence into a Ruby data structure that you can actually mess with and play around with and do whatever you want. So that part's really nice. The next part is recurring events. And I'm just going to go straight into everything is terrible here. Like, there be dragons, is that the phrase? It's truly horrible. Avoid at all costs if you can. Unfortunately, I can't because I'm making a calendar. And there are a lot of times when you might end up with making an appointment book or some sort of schedule, or triggering software to happen at every X days or something like that. So you may run into this as well. The problem is when you have a phrase like, yeah, every Tuesday at 2 p.m. X. And you might say, okay, I'm going to model this in my database. I'm going to say, like, yeah, January first Tuesday in January this year, I'm going to make a record in my database, and then I'm going to make another one for, a day later or a week later, and then I'm just going to fill this all the way out. And then quickly you realize, well, you can't do this because then, it goes to infinity and beyond. So at some point you have to realize if you're doing like recurring events, you can't really just straight model it in a database. It becomes problematic. So the way you end up dealing with that is you do kind of a shorthand notation. If you're ever into reading white papers, because I know you all are, Mountain Fowler wrote a really short, easy-to-read white paper on this whole thing. And he always called these like temporal expressions, which is a nice way of basically saying it's a shorthand for the computer to expand these out. In RFC 5545, they have something called rule. These are the things like nobody says out loud when they write them down or something like that, but it basically means recurrence rules, and this is basically how you tackle this. And this is how the iCalendar format handles this sort of thing, Google Calendar, all that sort of stuff. And this ends up being really problematic. Like, what happens if you change into daylight saving time at some point in the future? What happens if you have an exception to add to this, and you have another exception, but that's not an exception because that got moved to a different time on another day? Like, this stuff becomes really tricky. Rule handles this because it has a bunch of different ways of saying, yeah, exclusionary dates, or you go until a certain time, or you do a certain amount of counts, and all this sort of stuff. And I could fill an entire talk on dealing with all of this sort of stuff. In Rubyland, Ice Cube Gem is pretty dope. I would check that out if you're unfortunate enough to have to deal with this problem. But in general, it's just really complicated stuff. The other thing I'll kind of say along this line is like try to use real records here. So if you can put, instead of saying like, yeah, I'm making a haircutting appointment software thing, and instead of saying like, yeah, every 2 months do so-and-so, just say, oh, every 2 months do so-and-so for the next year, and then fill those records, put them in the database. It's so much easier. Kind of gets back to Avdi's point from yesterday, where it's like, instead of going all the way down into this most sophisticated, beautiful software, just try doing the really dumb way first, and it ends up, you could save yourself a ton of time. And like, that's the thing with like time. It's not even just like recurring records, but every sort of thing with dealing with time and time zones, like they just add up, and it gets more and more complicated as you go along. So yeah, try to place bounds on these and try to use real records. If you can't, I'm sorry for you. Okay, so on the way, pulling back and stuff. I've been working on this calendar for like a year. It hasn't shipped yet, don't worry. But like, I've been in this headspace for a long time, trying to figure out like how to deal with, date issues, time issues, all this sort of stuff. And these are kind of like the last couple of little bits I wanted to leave you with. One, use standards as much as possible. So obviously that means like ISO 8601, UTC, but that also means using time libraries and stuff. Use somebody else's work as much as possible, because this stuff is really hard to get right. There's a lot of little tiny edge cases that are just terrible to try and do yourself. The other side of thing is like simple and efficient is usually the best when it comes to time, which is really weird. It's kind of like an anti-pattern sort of. But like all of this stuff does layer, and like when you do all these hacks around time and trying to support this browser's locale and this person's preference and stuff like that, try as much as possible to make this simple. And not that I'm another person on stage saying like make simple software, but like this is something where like it's worth the extra time to try and figure out, oh, do we actually need all this complexity? Can we just do a normal whatever? And that's probably fine. And even if it's like an inefficient approach, or you're just generating the next years of records instead of trying to do your own recurrence scheme and stuff like that, that's probably fine, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. That's a cool song at some point, I think. It doesn't even matter. Okay. Jesus. Next part is like handle more logic in the client. This is also kind of backwards in a way, but as the more I've been doing work on my own stuff, there's so many like edge cases, especially when you start supporting time zones and all this sort of stuff, to where if you're trying to anticipate everything on the server side, it becomes really problematic. As much as possible, I've tried to make the server side for our stuff as dumb as possible, like just enters in UTC, leaves UTC. Like it doesn't really have any concepts of time zones or any real complicated stuff in that, because that stuff just gets really tricky. Because at some certain point, the server can't make these judgment calls because it doesn't have all the data of like where's the browser's locale, what they're expecting, all this sort of stuff. So like, yeah, you might have to like duplicate these efforts across different clients, different API consumers and stuff like that. But again, kind of go for like the simple approach more than anything else. And the last little bit, which is kind of weird, is like try to use durations and not time periods. And what I mean by that is like, I'd run into like the month problem where I say like, oh, give me all your events for this month. That seems like a pretty easy thing to say, but like that becomes really problematic when you start talking about like time zones, for example, daylight saving. Because the server can't just be like, well, we're just going to group everything. If you say like UTC 0 to UTC or the end of the month or something like that, the server can't quite know. Like it might miss some boundary events because you're shifted on that time zone sort of thing. It's tricky. So this is basically what I'm trying to say is like the server shouldn't really understand what a time period is, what a day is, what a month is. You should be able to query with specific boundaries and say like, yeah, from this timestamp to this timestamp, that's cool. Otherwise, it just gets really, really complicated. So that's mostly what I had for today. It's just like, time is really hard. That's cool. Hopefully I convinced you not to build a calendar. And yeah, it's if you're really into this sort of stuff, it is kind of fun to get into because A, the historical stuff in time is truly amazing in lots of ways. But B, like it's one of those problems that's like it's a hard known where we know what the answers are. It's just really tricky to go bat your head against a wall for a while. Versus like there are some problems that's a really hard unknown where you're like, I don't even know what the solution is. So anyway, long way of saying like time is hard. But worrying about this stuff makes a lot of sense because we all have users, and the better we can do stuff for our users, the better we're all off. So, thanks.
So I'm wondering if you have time for questions on time.
That's right.
Two can play the game. Any questions? Yes, we do.
Yeah, that was a great talk. So I wanted to ask, like, sometimes this happens that my server, like, let's say my server is Amazon in India and server is in IST time zone. And what I'm saving in my database is UTC. And all my logic is happening on that UTC, time zone. Mm-hmm. So it fails at some point. And being a developer, I might not know that all my services are running in which time zone. So in Ruby, is there a way we could make this consistent? That it throws an error or something, so that I know that something is wrong on there's a mismatch between the time zone or something like that we could do.
Yeah, probably. I mean, with Ruby, anything's possible. I mean, you could conceivably monkey patch something and say like, hey, if we're returning something that's not in UTC, like raise an error or something like that. I think that might be kind of interesting. But like, at the end of the day, like the baseline has to be UTC on all of your servers. Otherwise, it's just chaos.
So we actually face this problem. I don't know if there is a solution to know what because my local machine is running in UTC. I know when I developed, it worked fine, but I don't know what my server is running, and I tried a lot of things to do at that time. So it was I couldn't find a proper solution to know that was just my question, because I actually have faced this problem in real life. So yeah. So.
I mean, I think it just really depends on like, do you have access to the server? Like, set the server's time correctly, and hope and pray from there, I guess.
Yeah, actually, Zach, I think he just wanted to ask you, could you help him debug that issue, please?
Oh yeah, totally, no problem. Just use UTC.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So basically, I have a client-based application, not a server-side application. And so my question was about that point you were mentioning about keeping it simple and inefficient. So wouldn't you say that storing a UTC string is kind of a hack? And because the problem that I'm facing is whenever there's a daylight saving change, I get like list of bunch of 1 stars because their scheduling sort of breaks and I have to deal with that. So one of the solutions that I thought of was splitting the date and time and storing that in the database. So is that something what you was trying to say about simple and inefficient?
Yeah, I think part of the whole reason why people say like, use UTC everywhere and stuff like that is the underlying assumption that there's going to be like multiple users in multiple different places and stuff like that. And it's a little bit different if, for example, you have like a single user app on a local machine or a local phone or something like that, in which case you can probably get away with doing whatever for time, with the caveat of like, you don't want to have to deal with, I may be completely wrong on all that, because like there's all these other problems of like, well, what happens if you take your laptop or your phone or whatever to somewhere across the world and stuff like that. Then you have to deal with those different timestamps and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know. It's it may be a hack, but like all of time is a hack. So deal with it or something. I don't know.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Yep. That one actually got me. That was pretty good.
All right, any other questions?
Hello. What is the brand name of your shampoo?
Of my shampoo? I can't remember. It was whatever is like in the hotel right now. I knew the one I use at home is brown. Not the bottle. The bottle's brown too. But inside the bottle, it's like brown shampoo, which is really weird. So I'm sure it's something manly, like shampoo for men or something like that. So, yeah.
Come on, Piotr, don't give him a hard time. Okay.
Hi. So I wanted to ask you that what actually inspired you to get to this time concept and study about it? The facts that you mentioned during the talk, that was what you found out after you started working on this thing, or you basically had an idea of all these problems and then you started got inspired and then you started working on entire time thing?
Yeah, like I kind of started thinking about this talk like a year ago, and I just sort of like kept my eyes open for weird stuff, and I just had a really long list, and I maybe put like 30% of that into this talk, mostly because I find it kind of interesting. Mostly like a lot of the stuff I obviously have to do with what I'm building and stuff like that. So I don't know. I found time to be an interesting problem.
So what was the time when you thought that I have to dedicate it all to time? Like I have to dedicate all my time to time. Like.
Well, there's too much time. What's going on? What? What was the question? Or is it just time jokes? That's cool too.
No, it's okay. I think. Cool. Thanks.
Next time.
Not really a question, but I wanted to echo the idea that dates and times are really difficult. Back about 20 years ago, when I was working with Java, the date class was really problematic, and there was a guy named Rody Green from Canada who wrote a date time class that really improved it a lot. I got to meet him once at a conference, and I talked to him, and he said, "Yeah, the person who wrote the Java date class should be shot." It's always been a problem. It's a big deal.
I've heard similar, just from like reading stuff. I mean, it's been years since I wrote Java, but a lot of people bring up interesting Java date problems and stuff like that, and specific hacks you have to use in Java. I think they fixed most of that sort of stuff at this point, but yeah, the same thing. I can't remember if I can tell this story. I heard somebody was talking to the person who originally helped out or wrote the Apple calendar library and like time stuff for the iPhone, and they said it was just horrible. Like the code was the worst you could possibly imagine. I'm sure it's all perfect fine now and stuff like that, but everything is terrible.
Hi, can you elaborate on the point you made about use durations and not periods? I don't think I quite grokked it.
So as I was saying that, I realized I was doing terrible job at explaining in my head. Basically what I was just saying that like, so here's a specific example I was doing. Like I was trying to figure out a way of saying, okay, I have a month view of a calendar, and I'm trying to group all of the events on the day that they're on. So basically you can imagine like a calendar going like across like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then under each number you say like 2 events, 1 event, 0 event, stuff like that. And as I've got further down that rabbit hole, you start running into, well, the server doesn't really know what a day is. And I kept trying to say, like, give me all the events for, January 2. And, you can convert to different sort of stuff. It's just like the whole thing, and then pushing that on top of like a month view and all this sort of stuff. Like, so basically what I'm just trying to say is instead of querying the server for, give me everything on January 2, just say, give me everything between, 11:59 of the previous day, and then basically the entire duration, that span, rather than the day. So it occurs to me now I probably aren't explaining that well either, but we'll get there eventually.
It's like either time is hard or he's doing hard time. All right. Before we close this, I'm not taking any more questions except for one that Kapil had asked earlier. Because everyone is a GitHub fan here, I'm sure everyone wants to know how you got selected in GitHub.
Know more about the conversation and the interview process he had when he got into GitHub.
The interview process for getting into GitHub.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. No, the company was 8 people at the time. They were like, I was trying to switch jobs at the time, and Chris, the founder, was like, does anybody know Ruby? And I was like, yeah. He's like, does anybody know Java? And I was like, yeah. So I applied anyway. Didn't hear back for a couple of weeks, and then they were like, yeah, you should come do an interview thing, sit down with the 4 of us at a coffee shop or something. I was like, okay. And then 20 minutes before I was supposed to meet him, I got a frantic email saying let's just go to the bar instead. I was like, okay. So we go to the bar, and then eventually just got kicked out. It was a open mic night, and we were just we were talking, not being crazy or something like that. And they just were like, you should leave, because it was an open mic night and people were trying to perform and stuff like that. So that's all. It was a small company at the time, so.
It was a small company indeed. They're actually the people who invented the drink up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And de-invented it later on.
All right. So let's give him a loud round of applause, please.